I want to ask you something before we begin. When you think about the Iran-America war that started on February 28th, 2026, who do you picture as the main players? America, Iran, maybe Israel, maybe Russia. Almost no one says China, and that is exactly the problem. Because China is not a side character in this conflict. China is not a bystander watching from the balcony. China is the single most consequential actor in determining how this war ends, and it has engineered that position with a level of patience and precision that most Western analysts are only now beginning to fully grasp. Today I want to show you something that I genuinely believe most people covering this conflict have missed completely. I want to show you the invisible architecture of China's strategy, not just what China is doing, but why it is doing it, how long it has been planning it, and what it means for every single one of us who pays for oil, lives in a country affected by global trade, or simply wants to understand what is actually happening in the world right now. Buckle in, because once you see this, you cannot unsee it. On April 8th, 2026, Pakistan's Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif announced a ceasefire between the United States, Israel, and Iran. The world exhaled. 40 days of war. American and Israeli airstrikes on Iranian soil. Iranian ballistic missiles hitting targets across 9 countries in the first 24 hours. The Strait of Hormuz, the narrow passage through which 20% of the world's entire oil supply moves every single day, closed. Global oil prices above $110 a barrel. Goldman Sachs warning that every additional month of disruption suppresses American job growth by 10,000 positions. And then a ceasefire. It felt like survival. It felt like the worst was behind us. But from the very first hours after the announcement, something was broken at the foundation of that agreement. Israel said Lebanon was not included in the ceasefire. Iran said Lebanon absolutely was. Trump called it a historic pause. J.D. Vance called it a fragile truce, not a ceasefire, within the same 24-hour window it was announced. And Iran's supreme leadership made clear that the Strait of Hormuz would not reopen until their specific, non-negotiable conditions were met. So on day one, the two sides who had agreed to a ceasefire were describing two completely different agreements. America believed it had bought time to negotiate. Iran believed it had created a window to regroup, rearm, and reposition. That distinction, that fundamental disagreement about what the ceasefire even meant, is the hinge on which everything else in this story turns. The Islamabad talks followed on April 11th and 12th, 21 hours of direct engagement between American and Iranian negotiators, the longest such engagement since the 1979 Islamic Revolution. 47 years of almost no direct communication, and suddenly 2 sides in a room for nearly a full day. And it collapsed. Not because the 2 sides were infinitely far apart on everything. Analysts from the Center for Strategic and International Studies noted that the negotiators had actually found some areas of unexpected alignment. But they fractured completely on 2 things that neither side could budge on: nuclear enrichment levels and, more fundamentally, trust. Iran's parliament speaker Mohammad Bakir Kalibaf said something after the talks ended that I think is the most important sentence spoken by any official during this entire conflict. He said the American side ultimately failed to gain the trust of the Iranian delegation. Not failed to make the right offer, failed to gain trust. And when you understand Iran's recent history with America, that statement is not diplomatic rhetoric. It is a precise description of a real institutional wound. Iran was struck militarily in June 2025 while technically still inside a diplomatic process. It was struck again on February 28, 2026, the opening day of this war, while negotiations were still technically ongoing. Iran has now been bombed twice during periods of active diplomacy. When you walk into a negotiating room having experienced that, you are not negotiating. You are performing negotiation while waiting to see if the other side launches again. Vance left Islamabad on April 12th, saying the American side had made their best final offer. Pakistani officials who had organized the summit, who had invested enormous diplomatic capital in making it happen, described the American departure as abrupt and premature. Like the American side chose to leave before the conversation was finished. The next morning, April 13th, at 10 a.m. Eastern Time, the U.S. Navy's blockade of Iranian ports went live. Talks end Saturday. Blockade announced Sunday. Blockade active Monday. 48 hours from diplomatic failure to naval escalation. The ceasefire had transformed, in less than 1 week, from a peace process into a naval standoff. Now I want you to hold all of that in your mind, the failed talks, the blockade, the fragile ceasefire, because I want to show you something that has been hiding in plain sight. Over the same 6 days that this ceasefire was collapsing into a standoff, China made four distinct strategic moves. And when you look at them together as a connected sequence, not as separate news events, you see something extraordinary. Move 1, China brokered the ceasefire. This is confirmed. The New York Times, citing 3 Iranian insiders, reported that China applied direct pressure on Tehran to accept Pakistan's ceasefire proposal. Trump himself told AFP that China helped bring Iran to the table. China publicly positioned itself as a responsible peacemaker. The world appreciated it, and China built diplomatic credit with every major power simultaneously. Move 2, while brokering peace, China prepared weapons. On April 11th, the same day the Islamabad peace talks began, CNN reported that U.S. intelligence indicated China was actively preparing to deliver advanced air defense systems to Iran, specifically man-portable air defense systems, known as MANPADS, routed through third countries to disguise their origin. These are shoulder-fired anti-aircraft missile systems. They were used against low-flying American aircraft throughout the 5-week war. And China was allegedly preparing to send more of them. On the same day, its diplomats were facilitating peace talks in Pakistan. Public peacemaker, private arms supplier, simultaneously. Move 3, China defied the blockade in practice. On April 13th, as the blockade went live, China's foreign ministry labeled it dangerous and irresponsible. 2 days later, a U.S.-sanctioned Chinese oil tanker called the Rich Starry sailed directly through the Strait of Hormuz through the blockade, and the U.S. Navy watched it pass and did nothing. That moment was not incidental. That was a message. China was telling America, your blockade has limits, and we both know it. Move 4, China coordinated with Russia. On April 14th, Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov flew to Beijing for meetings with Chinese leadership. Red carpet, full diplomatic ceremony? The official agenda included coordinating positions on the Middle East. Simultaneously, President Xi Jinping issued 4 proposals for regional peace, framing China as a global stabilizing force, and used the phrase, "the world must not revert to the law of the jungle," a phrase aimed directly at American unilateralism. Now hold all 4 moves together. China helps broker the ceasefire. China prepares weapons during the ceasefire. China's ship defies the blockade. China hosts Russia to coordinate their joint response. All within 6 days. This is not a country on the sidelines. This is a country running 3 simultaneous tracks: public peacemaker, private arms supplier, and strategic coordinator with Russia. All at once. All with plausible deniability, carefully maintained at every step. Here is the piece of the puzzle that Bloomberg identified with unusual clarity. Before this war began, China was purchasing 95% of all the crude oil Iran exported. 95%. Through a network of sanctioned tankers, shadow traders, and financial arrangements settled in Chinese yuan, bypassing the American dollar entirely. So when America announced its naval blockade of Iranian ports, it was not simply trying to cut Iran's oil revenues. It was trying to cut China's access to deeply discounted oil that Chinese refineries depend on. And it was forcing China into a corner, either pressure Iran to make a deal on American terms, or watch America slowly strangle the supply chain that Chinese industry relies on. That is the actual strategic logic of the blockade, not punishment of Iran. Use of Iran as leverage over China. China understands this perfectly. And China's response has been to demonstrate quietly but unmistakably that the leverage does not work, because China prepared for exactly this scenario. Consider these numbers. China holds approximately 1 billion barrels in strategic oil reserves. In January and February 2026, before the first American bomb fell, China surged oil imports by 16%, specifically because its intelligence community anticipated this disruption was coming. As of today, China has 38 million barrels of Iranian crude sitting on tankers in the Yellow Sea, prepositioned outside blockade reach, untouchable. Russia, now China's single largest oil supplier, increased exports to China by 320,000 barrels per day in March alone. China has also been aggressively accelerating domestic electrification, reducing its structural dependence on Middle Eastern oil with every passing quarter. China did not stumble into this war. China engineered its own resilience before the war started. And a country that has pre-positioned 38 million barrels of oil and holds a billion more in reserve is not going to negotiate from desperation. Trump threatened China with an additional 50% tariff if weapons transfers to Iran were confirmed. China's foreign ministry responded by calling the intelligence reports completely fabricated. And Trump is scheduled to visit Beijing for a summit with President Xi on May 14th and 15th, 1 month from now. America cannot afford to blow up that summit. China knows this. That constraint on American action is part of China's strategic calculation. A professor at Singapore's Nanyang Technological University described China's objective with precision. China's goal is to position itself as a continued friend to Iran while remaining outwardly neutral, maintaining deniability, so it can keep relationships intact on all sides after the war ends. Help Iran survive. Deny everything. Stay at the table with America. Emerge from the conflict with influence multiplied across the entire region. I want to return to one specific detail in the CNN intelligence report because it reveals something about the architecture of China's strategy that goes beyond any single weapons transfer. The report says China is routing the manpad shipments through third countries to mask their true origin. Think carefully about what that means operationally. China has not merely decided whether to help Iran. China has decided to help Iran and has simultaneously decided to do so in a way that maintains total deniability. The routing through third countries is not a precautionary afterthought. It is the strategy itself. China wants to be able to look at American officials, look at international media, look at the UN, and say, as its foreign ministry spokesperson has already said, that these reports are completely fabricated. And China wants that denial to be credible enough that America cannot definitively prove otherwise without making an intelligence disclosure that creates its own separate diplomatic crisis. This playbook is not new. It is almost identical to what Russia did in the months before its full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February 2022. Incremental support, deniable transfers. Stay below the threshold of definitive confrontation. Let the ambiguity do the strategic work. And it is working for the same reason it worked for Russia. When the evidence is classified, when the proof requires disclosing sources, when confirming the accusation publicly creates more problems than denying it, the accused party has a structural advantage. America knows. America cannot fully prove it publicly. America is constrained by its upcoming Beijing summit, and China is using every one of those constraints simultaneously. Analysts at CSIS have outlined 3 possible trajectories for the ceasefire from this point forward. Scenario 1, genuine negotiated settlement. The second round of talks happens. The right people are in the room, not diplomats who need to call Tehran for approval on every sentence, but actual decision makers. Both sides find enough common ground on nuclear enrichment and security guarantees. A deal is reached. The strait reopens. Oil prices fall. The world's economy stabilizes. This is possible. Pakistan is racing to organize round 2. Turkey is working back channels. Both sides are still communicating. The venue, Geneva or Islamabad, is being discussed. But for this scenario to materialize, something fundamental has to change from Islamabad. Iran needs to send people with actual authority. Vance himself acknowledged that the Iranian delegation in Islamabad could not cut a deal without approval from leadership in Tehran. If that dynamic does not change, you get 21 more hours and the same result. Scenario 2. Manage permanent instability. A ceasefire that technically exists but is continuously violated in ambiguous ways. Like Lebanon right now, where Israeli strikes are continuing while the ceasefire supposedly holds. The war does not restart officially, but it never truly ends either. Oil prices stay elevated. Shipping routes stay disrupted. The global economy absorbs a permanent background tax of geopolitical risk. This scenario actually serves China, Russia, and Iran better than it serves America. Elevated oil prices fill Russia's budget. The prolonged disruption forces the global south to hedge away from American institutions. China positions itself as the responsible party, keeping channels open, keeping ships moving, maintaining relationships on all sides, while the American blockade, which its own allies refuse to join, slowly loses credibility. Scenario 3, collapse. A single incident, a rogue drone, a ship that crosses the wrong line, a weapons transfer that gets confirmed and cannot be denied, a Chinese-supplied manpad used against an American aircraft. An incident that cannot be contained, that does not stay ambiguous, that forces both sides to respond in ways that restart everything. China's behavior makes this third scenario measurably more likely than it would otherwise be. If China delivers air defense systems to Iran, and those systems complicate American enforcement of the blockade, and a confrontation occurs involving Chinese-supplied weapons, that is not a regional incident. That is a superpower confrontation in embryonic form. Right now, today, all three of those scenarios are simultaneously possible. We are in the window where the next 72 to 96 hours will begin to determine which path this takes. Part 6. Who the ceasefire is working for, 18C 2030. Let me ask you the question that I think clarifies everything. If the ceasefire collapsed tomorrow and the bombs started falling again, who has more to lose? America faces midterm elections next year. Oil above $100 per barrel is already showing up in gas prices, in grocery costs, in farm inputs, and monthly household budgets across the country. Goldman Sachs says the oil shock is suppressing American job growth by 10,000 positions every single month. American allies, Britain, France, the European Union, have refused to join the blockade. The chairman of the International Chamber of Shipping called it a step backward. The IEA described this war as producing the largest oil supply disruption in recorded history. Iran has absorbed an estimated $270 billion in physical war damage. That is a staggering number. But Iran is still standing. Iran is still controlling access to the Strait of Hormuz. Iranian ships are still moving through what is supposed to be an American blockade because the legal and practical limits of that blockade make full enforcement extraordinarily difficult. And Iran has China behind it in a way that America cannot directly confront without threatening the one bilateral relationship it absolutely cannot afford to destroy before May 14th. Russia is making an estimated $500 million per day in additional oil revenue because of elevated prices. The Iran war fixed Russia's budget, a budget that was being strained by the costs of the Ukraine war. And China? China has 38 million barrels of Iranian oil safely prepositioned in the Yellow Sea. China surged imports before the war started. China has a billion-barrel reserve. China is not desperate. China is watching. You tell me who this ceasefire is working for. And you tell me why any of those three countries, China, Russia, Iran, would rush to end it on America's terms. Conclusion, the pivot that changed everything, 2030, end. Here's the thing I keep returning to that I think is the most important frame for understanding this moment. Before February 28, 2026, China was in a serious trade war with America. Tariffs, technology restrictions, semiconductor bans, pressure on Chinese companies in international markets. The relationship was under genuine mounting stress. And then someone else started a war, and China did not fire a single shot, did not officially take a side, did not commit to any outcome. And somehow China emerged as the indispensable mediator, the country that helped stop the war, the country that holds leverage over Iran that America desperately needs, the country hosting world leaders in Beijing, the UAE, Spain, Vietnam, Russia, all in the same week that America is managing a blockade its own allies will not join. China's position in the world has strengthened enormously, and it cost China nothing militarily. No soldiers, no aircraft, no official commitment, just patience, preparation, and the disciplined execution of a strategy that was probably designed years before the first missile launched. A conflict launched by others has ended up expanding Beijing's influence. The ceasefire did not just pause the fighting, it reshuffled the geopolitical deck. And in the new arrangement, China holds the pivotal position, not because Beijing caused this war, not because it orchestrated every development, but because it positioned itself deliberately and carefully to be the clearest beneficiary of how the war evolved. The question now is not whether China is at the center of this. It is. The question is what America does about it, in a world where every tool of pressure has a cost, every escalation has a blowback, and the country you need to confront is also the country you're scheduled to sit down with in Beijing in 30 days. Watch the next 72 hours very carefully. Watch who shows up to round 2 of the talks and whether they have actual authority. Watch whether the Chinese tankers keep passing through the blockade. Watch what Beijing says, and more importantly, what it does not say. Because the gap between those two things is where the real story lives. And I'll be here when something breaks.